Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to AlphaBiolabs webinar entitled Discover the Latest in Alcohol Testing. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. My name's Andrew Priestley, and I'm the Marketing Manager for the legal sector, and I'll be facilitating the webinar this morning. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by my two colleagues. We've got Ashley Hodgkinson, who's our company trainer, and she will lead most of the webinar in terms of the presentation side of things. And I'm also delighted to have Sam Evans join us. Sam is one of our toxicology reporting scientists, and she'll be available at the end of the webinar for the Q&A session. In terms of our agenda, we've really broken it down to three key parts this morning. I'm going to very briefly start with just some stats around the latest trends in alcohol usage in the UK. I'm then going to hand over to Ashley, who will provide a summary of our alcohol testing services from collection through to reporting. And that will include all the different sample types that we can test for at AlphaBiolabs. Ashley will then also talk about why scram-cam alcohol monitoring should be considered in line with alcohol testing. We will then conclude with our question and answer session as we normally do. Thanks very much to those of you who have provided questions as part of your registration process. We will answer those questions for you in the Q&A. For anybody else, if you do think of any questions whilst we're presenting the webinar, then please feel free to ask those. To do it, the best way is to use the Q&A function, which is on the Zoom technology that we're using today, or you can use the chat function as well. So do put your questions through to us at any point, and we will answer them at the end in the Q&A. So let's get things started. We'll cover this quite a bit in the next 40 minutes, but I just thought it'd be useful to start with explaining what we mean by excessive alcohol consumption. So how much alcohol is seemed excessive? So based on guidance from the World Health Organization, if a person consumes more than 60 grams of alcohol, or 7.5 units, on an average daily basis over several months, this is deemed to be chronic and excessive consumption. So that's really sort of 6 or 7 drinks per day. It's anything up to like 50 units per week or above. Will be deemed chronic and excessive consumption. Now, for those of you that attended the webinars back in May on alcohol testing, you might remember these graphs that I shared with you. They've recently been updated by the Statistics on Alcohol Toolkit study. That's the name of the study. You can see for this particular graph, it's now extended until October 2023. This was a study of about 2,000 people aged 16 years and over in the UK. It's broken down by social demographic class as well. But basically, you might recall in May, we could see that when the COVID pandemic kicked in, so around sort of March, April 2000, the percentage of higher risk drinkers of the 2,000 in the survey, there was quite a big spike. You can see that on the graph there. When we talk about higher risk, in this case, it was people that drank at least 14 or more units per week. So whilst that was still significantly lower than the 50 units per week, which would be somebody who we would deemed excessive consumption of alcohol, it's still an area where potentially there's some risk. You know, drinking habits have increased with those people. You can see from the graphs as well that that's continued all the way up to last month. That higher level of consumption has increased compared to pre-COVID. So based on the survey pre-COVID, you'd probably say 1 in 4 people surveyed are probably in that high risk category. Since COVID, it's 1 in 3. So that is a bit of a concern, and we do expect that that will continue into 2024. And this second graph, again from the same study, looked at those who were in the category out of the 2,000 as being higher risk, and it looked at those who recognised that, again broken down by social demographic class, And of those who knew they were high risk, they knew they were increasing their drinking, what percentage of those were trying to restrict their consumption? So they realized that they needed to cut back. And you can see, I mean, it's looking at the graph there, fluctuates quite a lot each line. But what's interesting, point that I noticed for the C2DE social classes, which is more sort of like your manual labour, and also you're unemployed, the light blue line, in the last few months, that's dropped off quite a bit, which suggests that people in those classes are not, there's a lower number now trying to restrict their own consumption, so they're not really prioritising that, which is quite a surprise, really, considering obviously the cost of living crisis, that a lot of those people are not really trying to cut back on their alcohol consumption, which is also a bit of a concern. And we expect that will probably continue into 2024 as well. So hopefully that's a bit of an icebreaker for you, just to sort of set the scene, really. I'm now going to hand over to Ashley, and she's going to talk about our own alcohol testing services. Ashley.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for joining us. So as Andrew mentioned, I will talk through the options that we have for alcohol testing in hair and in blood and things like that. And then we'll move briefly on to what we can offer through Scram as well for alcohol monitoring. So if you have attended a webinar before, we've probably already covered this, but for those of you who haven't, starting off with testing for alcohol in head hair, there's 2 biomarkers that we're looking for, and that's what you'll see on your reports. So we test for ETG and for ETPA, which was previously known as FAEE, so you might know it more from that name. Both of those markers can be tested in head hair for up to 6 months as an overview. So if you have used us previously for drug testing, you may know that we can offer a segmented view, which gives you a month-by-month analysis, but the science behind it is slightly different for alcohol. So for testing in head hair, we're looking at an overview of either 3 or 6 months. And we're testing for that chronic and excessive consumption, which is what Andrew defined at the start of this presentation, which is roughly 7.5 units per day over a prolonged period of time. What that means is if you're looking to monitor someone's abstinence or if they are able to drink socially, then a different type of test might be more suitable. So for head hair, it's 3 or 6 months as an overview, chronic and excessive alcohol consumption. So we know what we can test for in head hair, but how do the biomarkers get there? If an individual does choose to consume alcohol, it's absorbed into the bloodstream and then metabolized, and then it grows out through the hair follicle, because each hair follicle has its own blood supply. This process takes roughly 7 to 10 days. So again, if you've used us before, you may notice that the date of collection of the hair sample versus the date that the sample covers is slightly different. And that's because we have to allow for that growth period for the alcohol to metabolize and then produce itself in the hair follicle to the point where we can cut it from the scalp. And that's why we always take head hair samples directly from the scalp as close as possible to get that most recent growth. Now, the growth of head hair on average is approximately 1 centimetre per month. And this is how we will distinguish whether an individual has a sufficient hair sample for testing or if we need to look at an alternative method. So if we are testing for 3 months, we will need 3 centimetres of head hair. If we are testing for 6 months, then we'll need 6 centimetres of head hair. If your client has shorter head hair, we do have alternative methods, but if you are wanting those 3 months, it's roughly 1 centimetre per month, so you'll know how long they'll need to grow it for. Like I just mentioned, we will be cutting the sample directly from the scalp as close as possible to make sure that we're collecting that most recent growth period, and we're looking for around 200 strands of hair. So sometimes people are a little bit shocked when we explain this because they assume a hair strand test is a single strand, but we do need around 200 individual pieces of hair per sample. That's about the width of a pen once you gather it all together, depending on the thickness of your client's hair. And we'll obviously do our best to collect it from a discreet place on the head wherever possible. So that's just to give you a little bit of background as to what we need for the test and then what we can produce as a result from that. We get a lot of questions and queries in about chemical treatments on her, so bleaches, dyes, hair straighteners. We get a lot of questions about things like that. As some of you may know, these tests can be affected by those types of things, by chemical treatments, and that's why we would always recommend when doing head hair that you do both ETG and ETPA together and not one in isolation. So on the screen now, you can see we've categorized them into the groups. So for ETG, hair treatments such as bleaches, dyes, perms, straightening of hair, excessive washing of hair could potentially decrease the levels that can be detected. And then likewise for ETPA, this is affected more by products that would coat the hair. So things like hairsprays, gels and waxes that contain alcohol. These can sometimes increase the levels of ETPA found within the sample. So that's why it's always best to do the two tests together. They complement each other very well. And we would always recommend that you do them together where possible. So if you do have a head hair sample that is over 3 centimetres and you're looking for alcohol testing, always do the two tests together. Obviously, in your expert report, if you choose to opt for one, we will detail any chemical treatments that are used and any possible effects that they may have had on the sample. So we've spoke about an ideal situation where your client has a sufficient sample for her head hair testing, and we can do both ETG and ETPA on the sample. That would always be our preference. But what happens if your donor has insufficient hair? So very recently, we've been able to introduce testing for ETG analysis on hair samples that measure less than 3 centimetres. So this is new for us. It's a great development. It means we can offer you more options for testing. In previous times, if your client had head hair that was less than 3 centimetres, we would look for an alternative sample. So things such as body hair or nails. Whereas now, as long as it's over 1 centimetre in length, we can still collect the head hair sample. The drawback of this is that we can only test for ETG. So obviously over 3 centimetres would be the best possible option because we can include ETPA. But if it is less than 3 centimetres and equal to 2 centimetres, then we can test for chronic and excessive use. So what Andrew referred to in the first slide. If it's less than 2 centimetres but greater than 1 centimetre, then we're just looking for excessive use, not chronic and excessive. So slightly different there in the terminology and what we can report on. Unfortunately, if the head hair sample is less than 1 centimetre, then we're unable to test it for ETG. And we'd look at other options. So this is just to advise that things have changed, they've developed, and we are now able to test ETG in head hair between 1 centimetre and then obviously all the way up to 6. So if your client does not have sufficient hair, other options for testing for alcohol, again, only covering ETG, so we can't test for ETPA in body hair, but we can do ETG analysis. If you do opt for ETG alone, we would always recommend you accompany it with a blood test, just so you're getting that overall picture of your client's use, really. It's possible to test on chest hair, leg hair, forearm, beard, back if your client has it. The only samples that we're not able to accept for alcohol would be underarm hair, just due to contamination, and also pubic hair as well for the same reason. All of the samples are based on weight. So before you start thinking we're going to ask your client to grow their arm hair till it's 6 centimetres, that is not the case. It is different for body hair. So it goes off the weight. The only exception to this is a beard sample. So if you did opt for your client to provide a sample of beard hair, then we would apply measurements to it. It's not 1 centimetre precisely. It does differ, the growth rate in beard hair. But if you were looking at that as an option, you could get in contact and we could advise you further on what we could expect to be able to produce from your client's sample. Again, these samples are cut directly from the root as close as possible and to get that most recent growth rate. And all of the body hair samples, aside from beard hair, would cover up to 12 months as an overview. So again, it might be suitable for your client if that's what you're after, but if you're looking at more specific timeframes, then you may need an alternative method because it is 12 months as an overview. We also can offer nail testing for alcohol. So this again would be for ETG only, so we'd always recommend accompanying it with a blood test if possible. This can be useful if your client does not have sufficient head hair or body hair, and depending on which type of nails you collect depends on the time frame this would cover. So if you are providing a sample of fingernails, we can look back up to 6 months. If it's a sample of toenails, we can look back up to 12 months. We ideally need 5 millimeters of nail to be able to conduct testing. We will take a clipping off each nail at the time of the appointment, but we need to have something to be able to cut. So if your client's nails are very, very short and all the way down and we're not able to clip them, then this might not be a suitable test for them. But if they do have sufficient growth on the nails, we can take this sample and offer this as an alternative of testing. We've put these in order of what we would recommend. So always go head hair first if your client has it available. If not, then body hair may be the next suitable, and then your nail testing. Just to give you a bit of a guide on what we would recommend for you, but obviously it's whatever works best for your client and what they have available at the time of collection. So I've spoke about accompanying these types of samples with blood testing, so I thought it'd be useful to cover what blood testing we can offer. So we do 4 types of blood testing for alcohol. We do PEth, CDT, LFT, and MCV. So we'll just briefly cover them individually. So your PEth testing, by far and away the most accurate of the blood tests that we can offer here. If we can recommend one of them to you, it would always be PEth that we would recommend because it's a direct marker of alcohol. And what that means is it's only present when someone's consumed alcohol. So it's not going to be affected by other things. It's a specific test, so it can look to help monitor abstinence, social drinking, excessive drinking. It can categorize the results into different categories depending on the levels that are found, and it can give you an indication as to what that level means as well. It's also the only blood test that can be done on a female while she's pregnant or for 8 weeks after birth because it's not affected by any change in hormones or anything like that. So it's a really good test. So if you do have the option of the 4 blood tests, we would always say go with PEth. It's the most accurate one, and it's going to cover a time frame of approximately 4 weeks. So it can bridge that gap between the growth of the hair, like we said, allowing those 7 to 10 days for it to be incorporated. So it's a great test. Other types of testing we offer, so we can do CDT testing if that's what's most suitable for your client. Again, this is going to cover 4 weeks approximately. So it's that short time frame that covers that growth rate gap. We wouldn't expect to see this biomarker elevated by a single binge drinking episode. It is more looking at that excessive consumption by a client. So again, it depends what you're looking for as to whether this would be the most suitable type of test. And it can detect alcohol abuse for 2 to 3 weeks after a person stopped drinking because it's covering that 4-week window. It can sometimes be affected by other things, by medication and stuff like that, and it's not suitable for anyone who is pregnant or for 8 weeks after they've given birth. So something to bear in mind if you do have a client who is pregnant, then PEth testing would be the better option. We can also offer a liver function test. So this is taking kind of a snapshot of the liver at the time that the sample's collected, and it's going to provide a report on how the liver's functioning, basically whether it's a healthy liver or whether it could suggest chronic and excessive alcohol consumption. We wouldn't recommend that you do the liver function test in isolation. We would recommend you accompany it with another test because, again, there are other things that can influence this. It's not solely attributable to chronic alcohol consumption, but it's definitely a good test to do, which gives an indication as to whether that could be the case. And the last of the 4 blood tests that we offer is an MCV test, and this is looking at the red blood cells. Again, not something we would recommend you do on its own. Always accompany it with something else where possible. But again, it can be an indicator for excessive drinking. It cannot be done on women who are pregnant or for those 8 weeks either. So it is only PEth that could be done in them circumstances. But if that's not your client, then it's a good indicator for excessive drinking when accompanied by other tests. So we've spoken about the different types of samples that we can collect, when would be more appropriate to use one over the other. So I just wanted to briefly cover collection of samples, how that can work, and then the chain of custody as well. So we do offer a UK-wide collection service where we can come out to either your client's home, your offices, we can attend prisons, contact centres, places of work if there's a suitable facility and room for it where it can be done in private, and obviously that your client thinks that that's suitable for the sample to be taken there. If you don't have an appropriate place, we can provide one. We have 13 free sample collection clinics across the UK and Ireland, where we'd be more than happy to facilitate your client coming in and providing a sample. All of our collectors are fully qualified and DBS checked, and it's 100% confidential service. So like I said, we will collect in almost any location as long as it's suitable and we can protect your client's privacy when taking that sample. So if you do have any questions about that, by all means reach out or use the Q&A function, and we'd be more than happy to confirm where would be suitable for collections. When we come out to see your client, it's really important that we maintain a strict chain of custody. Without a chain of custody, we're not able to report on the sample. So this includes things like taking a photograph of your client so we can prove who presented themselves as that person on the day of testing. We also ask for ID where available, just so we can double check the information. The collector will then take the sample, complete a collection form, which your client can receive a copy of if they wish, and a copy can also be sent to you if required. And then the collector will take the samples away with them and ensure that they reach the laboratory safely so that the report can be issued. Signatures are obtained from your client along every step of the way, so their initial consent to confirm that all the information they've provided is correct, and then also confirming that it was their sample taken and packaged. Any information about the chain of custody for any case can be provided to you if you do wish, if you need that information. So please get in touch if you do have any questions about the chain of custody or you want any further information about your client's sample once it's been provided. Once the sample's been through the laboratory and it's ready to report, you're given two options for your results. The standard option is a certificate of analysis, and then you can also request an expert report, which includes a much more in-depth information into the testing. I'll be completely honest, when we issue reports and we get queries back, I would say 99% of the time the question is answered in the expert report. So I would always recommend you get that. It'll answer any question that you have about your testing. The time to request a certificate of analysis over an expert report would be more if you kind of knew what the answer was going to be, if you knew what the results were to be expected. So for example, if you knew your client wasn't drinking to excess and you just needed to provide that proof to the court, a certificate would be perfect for that. However, if you think that you may be unsure what the results would show, or that there may be any questions from the court off the back of the results, then we would always recommend that expert report. It's going to cover everything you need to know about testing, including any medication that's disclosed, or any chemical hair treatments, heat hair treatments, and any impact that that may have had on the results. So it's a really, really useful report to have. Moving on, we just thought it would be a good idea to summarise what we've spoken about because it is a lot of information. So we've just popped them into 3 different tables. So the first one is comparing head hair samples that are available versus what analysis that can provide. So obviously our preferred method would be to do both ETG and DTPA, as we said at the beginning, because they complement each other very well. But for that, the length of the sample needs to be between 3 and 6 centimetres from your client, and that's going to test for chronic and excessive consumption. Cannot be segmented like drug testing can, as we covered earlier, and it can't specify particular days or times that the person drank. It's not that specific. It's looking at chronic and excessive consumption over 3 or 6 month period, depending on what your client has available and what the requirement is. Then for samples that are at least 2 centimetres but less than 3, we're looking at chronic and excessive consumption, but ETG only that time. And then any samples that are minimum 1 centimetre but still less than 2, we're looking at excessive consumption. And again, it's for ETG only. Samples less than 1 centimetre unfortunately cannot be tested, so you'd need to look at an alternative method, which is shown in this table here. So you've got your body hair, chest, leg, arm, back, whatever's available. And that's based on weight, so we need to have a sufficient sample, and it's going to cover a 12-month period as an overview for chronic and excessive consumption. If your client provides a sample of beard hair, that is based on the length. We've put the detection window as 12 months as an overview, but it's up to 12 months depending on the length of the sample, which again, we could always clarify if you were looking to go down that route. Then the other options are fingernails or toenails, which will provide either 6 or 12 months. That again is based on weight, and it's looking at abstinence of the person providing the sample. It's not looking at chronic and excessive consumption. So it completely depends on what your client requirements are, depending on what type of sample you have available. That should help aid your decision. And if you do get confused by any of it, or you're not 100% sure, give us a call, send us an email. We'd be more than happy to advise on your options and what we would suggest would be best. And then the last one is your blood tests. So you've got your 2 4-weeks there, which is your PEth, which can test for abstinence, social drinking and excessive consumption. Your CDT is looking at excessive consumption only. And then your LFT and your MCV are both looking at chronic and excessive. Again, remembering that CDT, LFT and MCV cannot be done on anyone who's pregnant at the time of sample collection or for 8 weeks after they've given birth. So moving on to scram testing, scram can be used either in isolation where necessary or after or at the same time, I guess, as your hair strand testing. So all the testing that we've just spoke about is looking back over a certain period of time, be that up to 12 months as an overview, depending on which type of sample you provide. Scram alcohol monitoring is going forward. So this is looking at what you're consuming at the time you have the bracelet on. So why would you consider it? It can be really useful for people who are trying to cut down on the drinking or for anyone who is trying to abstain. So it's going to take a reading every 30 minutes from the person wearing the bracelet, and then it's going to report that into our hub and we would pass that information on to you. It's particularly useful this time of year, so around Christmas time, where you may have clients who have children placed with them for a number of days. And it's not that they can't drink at all, it's just that they can't drink when the child is with them. Scram would be amazing for this because you'd be able to see the days that they had the children, where they should be abstaining, and then they can also still be free to indulge when the children are not with them, if that's part of the agreement and they're able to do so. And you can separate those days out so you can be fully aware as to what someone's up to while the children are placed with them. It also means that you can get results there and then. So it's not looking back over a period of time where someone may have a child in their care. It's looking real time here and now. Usually used if someone has maybe abstained for a certain amount of time and they need to prove themselves going forward. But yeah, great this time of year. And it's real time reporting. So every 30 minutes, we're going to get a reading from the bracelet. You can have weekly or monthly court reports issued for these, but in the interim, we would notify you of any alcohol consumption within 24 hours of the event being confirmed by our team. So we're going to keep you in the loop at all times, and then those reports that show all of the readings can be issued weekly or monthly, depending on what's more suitable. The bracelet can be fit within 2 days of instruction at a chosen location by yourselves, obviously based on your client's availability. And we would also leave a base station with the client so that those readings can be passed through to us at all times and we can act on those 24-hour event reportings. They are legal aid agency approved, and we can quote you for anything really, anything from 30 days up to sometimes a year. People have them on for and longer if required. So if you do want any more information about quotes for that, or more information about Scram, we did another webinar a couple of months ago that's available on our website, or you can get in touch. We'd be more than happy to help on it.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ashley, for that. Really insightful, and hopefully you all found that of benefit to you. Okay, so we're going to move on to the Q&A part of the webinar now. Thank you. A few of you have asked questions whilst Ashley was speaking, so we'll do our best to answer those questions as well. But we're going to start with the questions that have been asked by those of you who put those questions to us when you registered for the webinar. So at this point, I'll introduce you to Sam Evans. Sam, we've got a couple of questions here for yourself to start with. So the first one, how would you preempt in a court order the risk of the donor coating fingernails or dyeing hair or cutting their hair or nails?
I would say it would be difficult to preempt something like that or determine a level of risk relating to such things. However, I have seen in court orders prior to the testing being undertaken that the judges added a note that adverse inference may be drawn if a sample donor was to cut their hair, cut their fingernails, dye their hair, etc., any type of treatment applied to the hair or nails. But it would be difficult to preempt something like that, especially before the testing has taken place. However, we do assess in our interpretation how this may affect the hair and nail samples, for example. And it's important to note as well, with fingernail samples, we do not collect a fingernail sample unless the nail polish has been removed or the acrylics have been removed prior to this collection.
Okay, so I think you've alluded to this, but there's a second part to that question as well. So it's basically saying in situations where the donor is wearing nail polish or has dyed their hair, how do we interpret the uncertainty that will be expressed in the report? So do we, as part of our reporting, do we sort of issue some guidelines around that?
So again, with treatments, it's difficult to say to what extent these treatments may affect a hair sample or a nail sample. We know that ETG is soluble in water and as such is susceptible to being leached out of the hair through normal hygiene practices, such as washing the hair, or through the use of chemical hair treatments. Now, ethyl palmitate or ETPA is not soluble in water and is lipophilic, so fat soluble. This means that styling methods such as bleaching, perming, dyeing does not tend to significantly affect the ethyl palmitate levels unless there's been aggressive use of these products. Now, due to many variables, including the type of dye, bleach and the ingredients, and some studies have also shown that even if hair samples exhibit the same colour and are subject to the same degree of bleaching treatment, for example, the effect on the concentration of what is present in the hair is not the same. It could be due to the hair type and hair structure that plays a role of individual differences. And that's why we can't put a percentage on, or this will affect this hair sample by 90%, for example. I know studies have shown that when a hair sample has been incubated with hydrogen peroxide, so the key ingredient in bleach, it can reduce the ETG level by up to 45%. However, other treatments such as perming have demonstrated a decrease in ETG of up to about 95%. So we're talking quite a large range, quite a difference in the possible extent of how these treatments may affect a hair sample. And when we come to nails, nail polish, for example, could actually be beneficial to the cuticle because it acts, if it's used occasionally, it can act as a protection barrier, which means it's more likely you're actually going to get a better picture of alcohol consumption, as what damages the nails is washing your nails frequently, like most people do. So when you've got that protection barrier in terms of a nail polish, that could actually provide a better picture of alcohol consumption.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. Next question, another one for yourself, Sam. Is there a way of testing for binge drinking with alcohol testing?
Unfortunately, there's no one test specifically for binge drinking. When we talk about the hair alcohol biomarkers, ETG, ETPA, at AlphaBiolabs, the hair test that's undertaken is for evidence of the consumption of alcohol chronically excessively, as Ashley alluded to in the presentation. It's not a test to determine abstinence, social drinking or binge drinking, and it's not possible to determine exactly when alcohol was consumed within that time period or when alcohol consumption has stopped within that time period. It's simply just an integrated average of the amount of alcohol consumed over the entire approximate time period covered. Now, in terms of binge style patterns of alcohol consumption, A better test may be a PEth test, regular PEth testing, which would elevate in situations where higher levels of alcohol was consumed in a shorter period of time versus more social moderate alcohol consumption. And again, as you alluded to earlier in the presentation, we can now also test shorter scalp hair samples, lengths between 1 and 3 centimeters, for levels of ETG. This can then be reported as a negative result, excessive use of alcohol or chronic excessive use of alcohol, and can allow a larger window than approximately 1 month if regular blood testing is not possible, for example, or combined hair alcohol testing and blood testing is preferred together, as we see so often. With PEth, for example, we do have 3 different types of ranges. You've got absence or low, social moderate, and excessive. Now, evidence provided in the scientific literature, although we can't specifically say the number of units that represents those different elements, we can say that the lower range, or the absence or low range, is reflected from not drinking to averaging less than 2 drinks per day for several days a week. The moderate level of drinking is averaging between 2 to 4 drinks per day for several days a week. And in the excessive range, this is determined as heavy drinking, which is at least 4 drinks per day, several days a week. Now, this number of drinks per day should not be taken literally, but only as a reflective of research central tendencies. So what the literature has sort of combined to create these approximations of units per day.
That's great. Thanks, Sam. And one more question for yourself that's been asked. Do we wash the head hair sample on receipt, and can this have an impact on the result?
Yes, we do. So the hair is washed with a solvent before analysis to remove or minimize any external contaminants on the surface of the hair sample that may affect the analysis. Now, when looking at the studies, when they compare the different type of hair washes used at different laboratories, the results have shown that generally low concentrations of ETG and FAEs, including ethyl palmitate in the washing solutions, were found to be quite low. So the washing samples actually have little effect on the concentrations of ETG and FAEs. So in one study, for example, on this large study, I should say, the maximum portion of ETG, which was removed by decontamination, was around 16% for ETG. And in another study, it was reported that no significant differences between wash samples and hair without decontamination treatment was observed. So in that case, we can safely say our washing method will not remove a significant amount of ETG or ETP concentrations in any hair sample.
Great, thanks. And then one other question for yourself, Sam, which has just come in, which was sort of touched on, but how do you prevent contamination and deal with it if it occurs?
Yes, similar to it bounced off the previous question, actually. Because we wash the sample, it allows us to prevent this contamination, or at least minimize this contamination from exposure to anything on the outside of the hair. In addition, AlphaBiolabs use the cutoff levels that are recommended by the Society of Hair Testing, which is suggestive of chronic and excessive alcohol consumption. Each alcohol biomarker result is compared against the cutoff level, to which the statistically derived measurement of uncertainty allowance has been added to create what's called the analytical cutoff, above which a sample will be regarded as positive and below it will be reported as negative, which means that a positive sample is indeed unequivocal, which means that sample is indeed positive. Now, whether this positive result may have been influenced by cosmetic treatments, for example, or the influence of alcohol-containing products, as in the case of ETPA, obviously that needs to be considered. And this is considered in our interpretation. However, as alluded to previously, we can't say to what extent, but we can say whether this may have lowered the concentration of ETG or possibly produced a false positive in terms of ETPA when alcohol-containing products, i.e. such as hairspray, had been used.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Sam. Turning to Ashley now, there's a couple of questions actually on Scram, which we'll come on to. But Ashley, question just been asked based on what you were saying before. So it was stated that 200 hair strands are necessary, and that this roughly is the size of a pen or pencil bunched together. That suggests more than one pen or pencil. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. So the minimum amount of samples we would take for any case, drugs or alcohol, would be 2 samples. So we have an A sample that we test in the laboratory, and then we have a B sample that we keep hold of in case a repeat is required or a person can test the results. And then we can send that to another laboratory of equal accreditation to be tested. When you do combined testing, so if you do drugs and alcohol, then the number of samples would increase to 3. And then if you add on any additional drugs that maybe aren't in the standard panel, that can sometimes go up to 4. So standard for just an alcohol or just a drug test is 2. Combined testing can be 3 or 4. But yeah, as a minimum, it'd be 2.
That's great, thank you. Right, a couple more questions, just turn to Scram now. So these are for yourself, Ashley, really. So first question is, how effective or accurate is the Scram tag?
Yeah, so it's a really accurate piece of equipment. It can detect anything from as little as 1 unit being consumed. Scram themselves, so the people that manufacture the bracelet and monitor the TAC reports, they say that it can be anything from as little as 10% of that as well, but the standard is that it'll report anything upwards from 1 unit. So it's highly accurate and it's very effective, especially monitoring abstinence for people. Them knowing that every 30 minutes that result will be sent in has proven that drinking has either reduced or that they've abstained completely whilst wearing the bracelet. There's a lot of case studies available on it as well online.
Right, thank you. And does Scram give a reading of how much alcohol is being used?
Yeah, so for every let's call it a positive reading. So for every positive reading, every event, every drinking event that takes place, you will be provided with the TAC reading, which is the transdermal alcohol concentration reading. It'll also be categorized into either low, medium or high level drinking. And then we can compare that to roughly the number of units that would have been consumed in order to trigger that drinking event. So you get 3 pieces of information basically per drinking event.
That's great, thank you very much. One last question that has just come in on Scram as well. Can you obtain a Scram report on request at any stage, i.e. before a court hearing, or do you have to wait to receive the weekly or monthly report?
No, absolutely. You can have a Scram report as often as you need. If you know that you've got your court dates coming up, you can pre-order them if you wanted to. So you just have one like kind of ready to go for that specific court date, or you can ring up or email in at any point and request that a report's issued. Doesn't have to be weekly or monthly. They're just what we see kind of more common in the requests. We can do them bi-weekly, or you could have the bracelet on for a full year and only have one report at the end. It's entirely up to you and it can be customized to suit your needs and requirements.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for asking the questions that have come through today. I think we've answered most of them, just conscious of time now, so we will close the Q&A there. So thanks to Sam and Ashley for answering their questions. So just to finish off really, hopefully you found the last 42 minutes of interest. Before you log off, there will be a very short webinar survey that will appear on your screen. If you could kindly spend 30 seconds to complete that. Your feedback is really invaluable to us. So for the future planning of the webinars, if you could do that, it would be much appreciated. So why choose AlphaBiolabs? Just a quick one. So we do offer competitive pricing and a premium service. As Ashley mentioned, we have sample collection available from any UK or Ireland address. Also have free collections from any of our UK or Dublin local clinics. With regard to alcohol testing, we currently issue results within 5 working days of receiving the sample into the laboratory. We offer user-friendly court-approved reports, and you have access to dedicated account and case managers. We, of course, have the relevant accreditations as well, both in the UK and Ireland. We're ISO 17025, with the recently added Lab 51 extension, and we also have the ISO 9001 accreditation too. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much for your time today. We really do appreciate it. Please do get in touch with us. We are the experts in DNA, drug and alcohol testing for family law and social work professionals. All our points of contact you can see on the screen there. We're also on social media, on LinkedIn and X, which was formerly known as Twitter. Please do look us up on there and give us a follow. Also just want to mention that until the end of the year, we are actually offering 15% off alcohol testing and Scram CAM. All you need to do is, when you request a quotation, is quote the code ALC15 or ALC15, and we'll give you that discount in your quotation request. And please do share that offer with your colleagues as well. Thanks very much to Ashley and Sam for participating as well in the webinar today. And once again, thank you to you all for your time. We look forward to seeing you again soon on the next round of webinars. And until then, wish you the very best, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.